Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online series, Architects in Conversation, to Build for Art. I am Sean Anderson, Associate Professor in the Department of Architecture and Director of the Bachelor of Architecture program at Cornell University. I am delighted today to welcome Walter Hood to our program. I also want to take a moment to thank the incredible patience and guidance and consideration of Jane Nowasadko and Courtney Martin, and of course, the Yale Center for British Art for inviting both of us to join you today. A few housekeeping notes. Before we begin, I would like to note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature exclusively, located on your navigation bar, to gather your questions for Walter, and they will be answered at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit your questions and observations at any time. And if you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon of closed captioning on your navigation bar. Before we begin today, I would like to have three land acknowledgements, one for Yale University, one for myself at Cornell University, and one for Walter, who is speaking from Oakland, California. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shakticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Today, I am speaking from Cornell University, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayogohono, or the Cayuga Nation. The Gayogohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. And Walter will be speaking from Ohlone, Muwekma, and the Confederate villages of Lijan in Oakland, California. So, as a brief introduction to the supernova, I would like to say my friend and compatriot, Walter Hood. Walter founded Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California in 1992, a cultural practice working across art, fabrication, design, landscape, research, and urbanism. Hood creates urban spaces that resonate with and enrich the lives of communities while also honoring communal histories. He is the David K. Wu Chair and Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning and Urban Design at the University of California, Berkeley. He has also taught at the Yale School of Architecture and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and honors, and most recently was elected to the Academy of Arts and Letters in 2021. Welcome, all of you. Good morning, Walter, and it's a great pleasure to be talking with you today.
Good morning, Sean. That was a lot, man. You did really well. Very good. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Thank you. I think in this age of Zoom, we are still in the midst of Zoom. We have to have 3 land acknowledgements today, which is a kind of ripe and poignant kind of triangular kind of positioning of where we are and where we can go today.
No, it's beautiful because, it actually brings the landscape forward, right?
Absolutely.
And being someone of the landscape, it centers it in our conversation, so it's perfect.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, of course, once again. I think what we're going to do today is begin with a slide or an image of your work as a painter. And those of you who are joining us, Walter is perhaps best known for his work as a landscape architect and designer, but he is also very much a trained and accomplished painter. And when I learned of of this kind of realm of his work and his thinking, I thought it would befit the beginnings of our conversation today by looking at just one image of his studio and think about not only where we are speaking from and to an audience at the Yale Center for British Art, but the ways in which your art, Walter, your painting specifically, contributes to, amplifies, responds to, and perhaps challenges some of the work that you do as a landscape architect. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your painting practice, where it comes into your process, if at all, and furthermore, how does the painting practice respond to your work?
Well, thank you. You're very kind to say I'm an accomplished painter. First, I will say I am not. I don't spend enough time at it to be accomplished. I'm hoping to spend more time. But it's interesting for me, how painting has always been part of myself. I've always drawn, I've always sketched. And as an architect, I was one of those architects who always sketched every place I went. And when I wanted to go to the American Academy, it was 20 years ago, my proposal was to paint, which I think I wanted to just get out of the realm of architecture, landscape architecture, and just go to a place that I had never been before. And spending the year at the Academy and trying to paint was probably this cathartic year for me because I didn't make anything other than bad paintings, right? But it was wonderful in that it helped me to kind of focus how I see the world and how I see things. And slowly it just became part of, a practice, not sketching anymore. It kind of weaned me off sketching and actually helped me to become a painter, and which is about space. It's about the canvas. And so that was one of those moments where I was able then to bring that back to the work and to really, again, not think about the drawing as a two-dimensional sort of situation where you're moving things around, but to think about how to actually make space, which in landscape is really, really hard because there's just so much stuff out there. And so the painting, is that place that I can go to and struggle, right? In the other places, I feel more comfortable. And a couple of years ago, I was at Titus's studio in New Haven, and he said something to me that resonated, that when he first came to art school, he had to work on his technique, and things like, to really put time in. And that's something that I'm looking forward to in the future, actually just putting time in and really think about more technique and things like that. So
Absolutely. I
long
can't.
answer.
We all have to work on our technique in whatever capacity that technique takes us forward in many ways. So I think just as a reference, when you're speaking of the Academy, you're speaking of the American Academy in Rome, of which we are both fellows, and it's an extraordinary space. In fact, to do bad paintings. And in my case, it was bad drawings. And as much as I have always loved to sketch, I am not I don't have the dexterity perhaps to make sketches like I really wanted to. And so I completely concur with the notion that we all need to take time for ourselves in order to imagine new possibilities for the ways in which we create and imagine our work. And I noticed that in these paintings, they're predominantly figurative. And oftentimes when we see landscape architecture, we forget that the figure is a person and the person occupies space, but that space is defined and, in effect, an invisible design that in a way erupts, especially in the work that you do. And then you're speaking of Titus Kaphar, no?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
So
Sorry. I'm doing first names on everything, right?
it's okay. Titus's work is incredible, right? It's as well as a reference. So I thought for our viewers today, we would begin with painting. And every time I've been to the Yale Center, the painting and the architecture, obviously, are in a beautiful harmony, as it were. So I think what we'll do then is move on to the next image. And I wanted, Walter, as the title of this series is, I believe, Building for Art and Architecture for Art in a way. So for the remainder of our conversation, I think we're going to be looking at the ways and thinking about the ways in which your work as a landscape architect, in as much as a painter, responds to and perhaps even reimagines the ways in which architecture is reflected in the landscape, and by extension, how the landscape is reflected potentially also in the architecture. And I wanted to begin then with a quote of yours. So I hate to give you a quote that you have said, but I think it's worthwhile to think about in the context of not only what we'll be looking at today, but also the notion that landscape architecture is a very public phenomenon. It is often designed and created for public spaces. And so I'm to keep that in the back of our minds today of who is the public and how does this public inflect the ways in which architecture is experienced. So the quote, Walter, short one. Museum landscapes are 21st century parks, exposing the public to diverse and powerful art experiences. They provide accessibility to their local community and beyond. They are vitally shared public spaces that enhance the human experience, forging a more inclusive experience for museums. So there are a number of terms that you use there, and I wasn't sure in what context you spoke these words, but the first one that kind of stood out for me is experience. And the second is more aligned with the work that you and I have done more closely around representations and building for inclusion. So if you would, could you kind of introduce your practice in terms of the work that you've done in museal spaces, inside and out?
Well, first, I mean, that quote is referencing my practice and the projects that I've worked on, because not all museum landscapes open themselves up, right, to the world. And we've had the opportunity to work on multiple institutions that basically, as part of their goal, said we want to open ourselves up, right, to the public in a certain way, even though the museum is a closed entity. And the first one we worked on was the Young Museum in San Francisco with Herzog and Limeron. And they had a very bold concept where the entire front face of the museum would be open. You didn't have to pay, you could just literally come through and have an experience. And then there were two gardens on both sides that allowed the public to actually be in them 24/7. And that was kind of the first time we really started thinking about the role of these institutions to a more diverse crowd, being in a park like Golden Gate Park, and having donors who actually saw or beget to them that they wanted to provide resources for a public. One was for small kids and the other was for sculpture. And it was a wonderful experience to kind of think about how these landscapes could be shared. And we had history in the park to play off of. Like in the sculpture garden, there was the Japanese tea garden, which again is almost a century old that we could riff off of. And then on the other side, we had the history of the museum, which was this loved thing in the city that we could actually bring pieces of it back, which was the Fountain of Enchantment, right? And so again, using landscape, the medium, to actually get people to remember the past, but also to think about that they're part of a future. And I think that's a very worthy goal for a lot of institutions. The Cooper Hewitt is another good example, where it's on Fifth Avenue in a place where, most people think, it's the Museum Mile, it's very high end, but to be able to actually have a small garden that was once belonged to, really rich people, to be open to a public and to actually see its relationship to Central Park, which is something real that's right there that you normally didn't think of, Engineers Gate. And we created a design that tried to merge, again, these two things together. And so really thinking about, talking from painting, this notion that how we see the landscape, or, we actually, I think JT Mitchell talks about this, we always see through it to a certain degree. And so the medium helps us, right, to whether it's rocks, whether it's trees, whether it's the sky, whether it's the horizon, these are ways in which we could bring people into spaces and give them just a different reference.
Nice. There's a degree of not only a transparency then with the landscape in terms of it foregrounding or even backgrounding, if that's a word, to the architecture or the building, but then more perhaps metaphorically, it becomes that threshold through and by which one understands one's relationship to that building. And so I think for the Broad, for instance, because this particular image is taken from the side of the Broad. So the Broad is on a major road in the middle of Los Angeles, and you find solace against this highly articulated contemporary building that has its own internal sequences and experiences, to find repose in a space of, I believe they're olive trees, right?
Yeah, they're really old olive trees. They're over 100 years old. And in a way, I think these projects for us, and it might sound sort of counterintuitive, but for us in designing, we are not looking to make landscape and architecture seamless, right? Because we're taught that, these things have to go together. But in a way, they're actually playing off of each other, right? I mean, the olive trees are not trying to be inside the vault and the veil, right? They're just sitting next to each other, trying to have a conversation, right? And so scale-wise, you don't even see the building. I mean, you only see this much of the building in the scheme. And so these old olive trees are holding their own next to this giant thing because they themselves have an expression, right? An expression of time, an expression of surface, an expression of mortality. All of these things is happening within that small grove, which, working with Liz at Diller, Scofidio, we really pushed to find the right tree. And I mean, this was like our staff, like 18 months trying to find the right thing, and we landed here. But, this landscape is on top of a deck, actually. So there is no landscape. And so sometimes you have to imagine new landscapes to be in places where there is nothing, right? Versus I talked about the Cooper Hewitt, there was Central Park, right? There was something there. And so again, these trees as a medium, they're actually doing work. They're doing a lot of work. Yeah. And I always notice when I go there, people are always taking selfies with the trees, which again reinforces this thing that, they're holding their own.
Yeah, no, I think I would take a selfie with this tree. I mean, I remember sitting in there thinking, wow, this is such a, on one hand, a radical departure, but then just aesthetically, the olive trees, just their bark, their hewn kind of toughness, their resilience reminds me of the building facade in and of itself, right? Yeah. So they do speak to each other in various ways that they also reinforce, I think, as what you said, reinforce each other in terms of stolidity, in terms of resilience, and of course, with the heat wave that I believe is still going on and will no doubt continue in various ways, these trees will start and will always, I think, as long as the building remains, be a reminder that We are all embedded in multiple temporalities, right? We are as public or as members of a public or as a community, what the landscape can bring is not only a sense of one's connectivity to the ground, to the landscape, but also one's continuity or presence within time. And so I wanted to move on to the next image, which I believe is of the Cooper Hewitt. No, it is. I'm sorry. And it is. I flipped my notes here. So with the Cooper Hewitt, which I believe you opened in 2015, almost around the same time as the Broad, more or less. I think here you also worked with Liz and Rick and the office.
Yep.
In a very different set of circumstances. And as you say, this is almost the front lawn of the former Carnegie Mansion to the public park. So already there's a degree of openness and of closure. And you said earlier that museums are often read as closed entities, even though in theory they are open to everyone in various ways. And so I wanted just to respond to that for a moment and ask, for a project like this, which doesn't necessarily have a kind of monumental character like the olive trees at the Broad, what were the kind of key considerations for you or for all of you as a team in responding to this now Smithsonian Museum and the public space of New York City?
I mean, it was very different. I mean, here, the museum's goals were to make this more public, to open it up. So that was a criteria. We want to use our garden more, right? We want to program it. We want to use it. And the lawn then became this kind of quintessential kind of feature for events. I think you see here a lawn party, but they wanted to use it as much as possible, right? And so that was, pretty much it, right? And so trying to find a way, it being a federal project, being with the Smithsonian, knowing that its history, that we had to go through a process. And so we were able actually to find the original landscape plan, which cultural landscapes, have, and we were able to sort of create a narrative around restoring the garden back to its origins. And its origins, you see in the foreground here, there was a rockery, which was a circular kind of form that was never implemented in its form. And so using that as a way to talk about the geology of the island, bringing back the schist, we wanted to bring things from the quarry, which we actually, when we dug here, we actually found all this rock, which was on site. And so it actually created the rockery in itself. And so this is real New York schist, right? And then the openness was less about the kind of the perimeter fence. And for me, the first time I was at Central Park across the way, looking back at the garden, I noticed you could actually see in the garden when you're raised up above at Engineers Gate. And so what you're looking at, I would say the background here is Central Park. And so just seeing that the trees actually create this larger extent. And for us, that was a way to think about the planting, trying to marry them. So when certain things bloom across the street, certain things bloom in the garden. So really trying to create, right, this relationship through the flora, which we noted that, some of the more, flowery plants were actually part of the City Beautiful movement, which was not part of homesteads. And so bringing some of that across the way. So again, thinking of the garden as this larger expression versus something that was hermetically, sealed within the gates. And Diller Scofidio really came up with this really wonderful way of using the classical architecture in a very contemporary way, right? Putting lights in the columns and having a new fence. And so this notion of dealing with history is a very, we didn't do a lot, right? But we just did enough to me to actually make this place anew. So it's not as if we had to import olive trees here. We basically just had to clean things off, right? Dig a little bit, and open things up, which again is a different way of seeing a place, right? And so again, just different interpretations.
Well, it has created a space unto itself. I would say it's almost not to be trite, but it's an outdoor room that is bounded on one hand by the very classic reticulated facade and that of the facade of the park, if you will. The facade of Central Park are the trees. And if you've walked down Fifth Avenue or up Fifth Avenue, of course, those trees become not a barrier, but somehow a screen through and by which we all passersby see through, but also see from.
Right.
And what I
in the winter, it's very different, right? I mean, because when the foliage goes away, you actually have this larger space.
Indeed.
Right? So we really love this idea of compression that happens and then this kind of openness that happens. And that's what I really miss on the West Coast, right? Because we don't have a lot of woody plants here. So it's always, the West Coast is always big, right? It's always, particularly here in the Bay Area, it's always, you can always see a mile and a half away. So it creates a different way where on the East Coast, you're in the forest. And so again, using those ideas and how do you actually think about space, really creates a wonderful, dialectic.
I like this notion of both kind of interior, exterior, but one might also argue that it's one of belonging and not belonging if we take the extension of the museum as a closed space. But I would also like to think about, I remember when I was working in the museum, someone said to me, well, you realize that the museum is a mirror. And I wonder for you, does the landscape in a context like the Broad or the Cooper Hewitt or the next project that we'll be looking at in a few minutes, does the landscape for you become a mirror of the museum, or does it begin to interact in a kind of I don't want to say autonomous way, but in a way that is perhaps reflective of the individuals that you hope and the communities that you hope to invite into them?
I think a little of both. I mean, I think, working with architecture, there is a dialogue, right, between landscape and architecture. So sometimes that mirror, like I said, sometimes it could be really thinking about, at the De Young, we were saying, when you're in the garden, you see the museum different. When you're in the museum, you see the garden different, right? And so there are these ways in which the building and the landscape speak to each other. We brought courtyards into the De Young so that, you would see certain types of plants when you're inside and you didn't see them outside. Where, the Broad, the vault, and the Vale was really about its kind of hermetic self. And so that then pushed the trees to really be strong enough to create a grove that could be about itself. Where at the Cooper Hewitt, it's this historic little piece of green, which to expand it, one, there is this reciprocal relationship. There's a terrace, the Arthur Ross Terrace, and these relationships formal. But the larger piece, Central Park, 800 so acres, when you see the plan of Central Park in this little postage stamp, right? That's for us a really beautiful thing because the park then can just grab it, right? I mean, so it could be part of it because of its scale. And so each one becomes for us, just ways of thinking about the place, which is not Fifth Avenue, but it's Central Park, right? I mean, it's these larger pieces of landscape.
Right.
Which I'm more interested in. Golden Gate Park is a giant sand dune. The New York, a big rock of schist. Charleston, a wetland. And so really thinking about these larger landscapes, there are ways in which you can find then ways to, express that at this other scale, where someone might come to the Arthur Ross, to the garden, and then be in Central Park and go, oh, I remember seeing this over in the garden. Or I remember, having an experience during the spring where I saw the same flowers or something like that.
I mean, it speaks to me as also you are investing in and extending millennia of history, right? The island of Manhattan as an island of schist, Golden Gate Park as presumably a number of sand dunes and so forth, before the interventions that we now know. and experience and see, for better or worse. And so this connectivity to time, once again, I feel is so incredibly vital for your work. And also, you and I have talked about memory, and not only the role of memory in the imagining of space, but the role of memory in terms of also the landscape specifically. And when you were mentioning the circular rockery, I was reminded of the artist David Hart, who did an installation, I believe last year at the Glass House, where he too created a circle that once was in the landscape made out of flowers that changed through the seasons. And these kind of moments challenge the viewer, challenge us to imagine the continuities or discontinuities of time. And of course, the climate crisis, climate change is wreaking havoc with the time, with seasons, with how plants and the natural world and the animals all are present, interdependent, and are affected by these changes in the landscape. So I think we can move to the next image. And I had asked you, Walter, when we began this conversation more than a year ago, I believe, with Yale, maybe a year and a half even. And in fact, we met, you and I, in a similar situation late last year, when we were asked to talk about democracy. So we're not going to talk about democracy today. Maybe a little bit, but instead, I think we're going to kind of shape our conversation now around this connectivity to long history, to deep history, and to memory. And in January of next year, January of 2023, the International African American Museum will be opening in Charleston, South Carolina. And as a South Carolinian, I know this location quite well. And I know also a degree of the history of what this site means, not only to the museum and its future visitors, but also to you as an artist and as an architect. So would you first maybe introduce this project and then talk about some of the interventions that you have made there?
Yeah, this is the International African American Museum in Charleston, designed by Paycock Freed. The late Harry Cobb was the design architect. And it's a project that has been, I guess, on the boards for a very long time with Mayor Joe Riley, who's now retired, but one of the longest serving mayor, I think, in the US, where he had always thought that this should be a place where there should be a museum that talked about the Low Country and the history of slavery in Charleston. And as we know of Charleston history, it took a really long time to even get to this point. But the site is on a space called Gadsden's Wharf, which historians believe more than 40% of the African slave diaspora landed here. I think Charleston and New York were the largest ports of importation of slaves from Africa. Here, Harry, reached out to us, and the way the project started, Harry said, this project is really not about a building, it's about landscape and structure. And he said, I have Guy Nordson working with me, and we want you to do the landscape. And what he was getting at was, in Charleston, this is hurricane territory, and the codes suggest buildings have to be lifted off the ground. And he saw this as a place where, working with the mayor, they located the site not knowing it was Gadsden's Wharf. So it was, the site before was across the street where they were trying to work. And story is that Harry came to Charleston and was like, this building should be on the edge of the harbor. And they pointed to an open space there. And the mayor was like, we're about to sell this space. And so they basically had to rethink it. And they it was a park. And then the historians uncovered that it was Gadsden's Wharf, right? Which is, American history. We lose these sites and somehow we bring them back. But this is a real site. Archaeology was done. They actually found the old warehouse. They found the edge and they found remains. And so this is the place where one of the largest wharfs were located and where slaves came from Sullivan Island after they were stored for a while, incubated, and then brought here, placed in warehouses and waited for sale. And of course, many perished here along the way. And so it's a very powerful place. And it always occurred to me that if you go back and look at when it was a park, it still had a presence to it. Right? If no one told you, felt like there was something kind of weird about it, because it sat between these condos and it was open. And now when I see the manifestation of the building and landscape, it almost feels like it exhumed itself, right? It just kind of rose up from beneath the surface. And the architecture is non-rhetorical. It's a very simple bar building. And Harry talked a lot about that he didn't want it to be rhetorical in any way, and that the ground plane should be the powerful piece. And we were just really amazed that we could work on something, this powerful. And what you're looking at here is the city side of the museum, where we wanted to create, again, the entire landscape is kind of working really hard to sort of make sure you see it, right? And you feel it. And so we created this topographical set of dunes to really talk about, historically, these would have been these primary dunes, right? That you would have come through for the marsh, which are gone now because everything is built. But we wanted you to sort of break through a landscape before you found this place. And then everything else under the building is made of tabby, which is an invention, through slavery of shales and sand to create a kind of a concrete. And the columns are 2 meters wide, and they literally lift off the ground and hold the building up. And the idea is that, the tabby is really the shales from the Atlantic Ocean, right? And so this notion that the seabed, you're actually walking on the seabed.
No, it's just your description immediately reminded me of being in Senegal, in Dakar, a few years ago, and having returned actually a few years ago, and being at the door of no return.
Yeah.
How not only is there a building that captures this threshold between once being free and now being enslaved, but also this threshold between land and ocean, and eventually land again, which would have been in many cases this.
Yeah. No, it's a powerful landscape, Charleston. I mean, you being from this area, I think the way, on the West Coast, you look at a wetland and it has, it feels like it's just for animals. But here in South Carolina, you're in the muck. It's actually people, people in their knees. And, I had a very prophetic sort of experience here years before. Me and another artist, Ernesto Pujo, a friend asked us to go out fishing with them. And this friend was non-brown, he was white, and Ernesto was Cuban. And we go out and they were like, we have to wait for the tide to go out, right? The tide went out and then we could fish. And we had to wait for the tide to come back in, and the boat couldn't move. And so this gentleman asked us to get out and pull the boat. And there was a moment where Ernesto and I were pulling this boat in the marsh of Charleston in the Low Country, right? And I looked at him and he looked at me. And there was that moment, we didn't even have to say anything, right? That you were in that place and literally I could feel my ancestors. I could feel this tug, and that to me is what this place is about. Every time I go there, I have this feeling, my ancestors are all around me here. And it's one of the few places that I've experienced where it's just so thick in the air, that you don't have to really articulate anything, you feel it.
I think that holds true for much of the Low Country and much of the islands that are, of course, across the South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia edges, right? These edges become so powerful because they too mark the beginnings of a kind of land. And in this case, in the museum's case, that history is foregrounded on the very land that you are going to be walking. And so I think the next image has an overhead view of the museum. Yeah, so there you are. And this view is obviously toward the water. And then I saw that there's a grove of palm trees as well that reminded me, I love palm trees, both West Coast and East Coast, left and right coast palm trees. But palm trees are also this incredible resilient tree that every time I see them, I think of deep time and how long have these creatures, if you will, been around, and what do they signify today? So I think the presencing of the landscape, the presencing of an architecture, and of course its contents, discontents maybe, in the case of this museum, speaks to them this threshold that we've been talking about, and the ground and the significance of the ground itself. Would you want to comment on this image, Walter, or the next one? Because I know the next one is a detail.
Yeah, I can just sort of say a few things about this. You sort of see the ground plane where the two legs of the museum kind of sit out. That's a fountain that will be flooded with water, right? That entire piece. The back end of it, the furthest inward, is where the old line used to be of shore. And so in a way, the fountain, that plane, is a metaphorical, right, for the ocean, the Atlantic, right? Because that would have been the place. And the palm trees are next to the space where the warehouse sat, and we don't own all the property. And so there are a set of experiences on the far left here. There will be a boardwalk that you walk through the warehouse, a completely separate experience. The palm grove, there will be voices in the grove, right, in different dialects. Underneath the building, the fountain serves as this new horizon, right, when you look back out on the piece. And again, this is all public, and this will be flooded with water intermittently, and the water will drain out, leaving puddles, and then it'll fill up again. And so it's almost like a tide tribute to a certain degree. And we saw it as this way of not making a thing as a memorial, right, but creating a landscape that actually talks about our ancestors in different ways. And on the right-hand side is a sweetgrass field on the right-hand side. And what's really wonderful about this right-hand side landscape that has nothing in it, what's below it is a pipe that's basically keeping Charleston dry, right? And so there are this kind of layered infrastructure where you have the sweetgrass that used to be in the marsh, and underneath it, there's this infrastructure that's at work as the tides come and go.
Superb, superb. Could we maybe go to the next slide, please? Yes. Yeah. So these are details of the fountain. And these fountains obviously have bodies, in a way, right? The outlines of bodies, they remind me of the troubling drawing of the Brooks slave ship, of course, but there are also bodies. Would someone, when the water drains, are they to walk on this, or is it something you walk around?
Well, we will see, right? There is a central walkway, because as we were developing this, some of the elders in town were like, we don't want people stepping on bodies, right? Which I thought, again, as a process, we presented this and people were like, oh, hold on, maybe this is too much. Because this kind of imagery is abstract, but there are corpses that are on the ground. And so I'm hoping there's a reverence, but I'm also hoping, that if someone wants to lie down on it, I think that's fine with me. I mean, to me, I would love if there was a celebration, a performance piece, right, where people were part of the water. And so I don't have a preference one way of engagement. That's for the director, right, in the museum. But we wanted it to be this visual relief. And the image on the left, you can kind of see it my interest is in when the water drains out, there will be these puddles, right? Because the fountain is kind of sloping. And so the waters will find these little low points and hopefully create this abstraction. It's facing east, so in the morning when the sun rises, we'll have this light is, what we're really interested in, how that light will change during the day. But also this one on the right, you kind of see this density, right, of the body in space. That's another thing that, again, when you look across it, it almost reads like a topography. And then in the middle, when you look at a detail, it becomes highly abstract, right? And so the tabby is actually in the body, right? So that's the tabby and everything else is smooth.
Superb. Superb. Walter, I am very conscious of our time, and we have two excellent questions here. But I think the first one relates very specifically, in part, to what you were just describing, which is about the performativity of, in this case, a fountain, but the performativity of bodies in space and the bodies in perhaps even a designed landscape space. And so this viewer asks the following: how do you consider or think through incorporating performance space in your museum landscape designs for museums that want to hold public programs outdoors, such as concerts or poetry readings? And are there designated spaces in your designs for these cases?
No, I think that's a really good question. And, for us to think about, that there should be this kind of program in this kind of space, we tend to think less about what those activities might be, but actually thinking about making space, right? So once you think about making space, then people react to that, right? Versus, if you make something that's open, that just feels completely vacuous, people will feel that. And so, I'll give you an example. At the Grove, there's a grove and there's a lawn. If you go there, that lawn, kids love that lawn. It's a little piece of lawn, but it's a space that the Grove creates, right? And again, really thinking about making space with landscape. So we use things like groves, alleys, we use topography, ways in which to sculpt space. And with that, then people react to it in ways that sometimes I couldn't imagine. Like we did a park in Oakland, Lafayette Square Park. We did a hill 7 feet tall, 70 inches in diameter in this park. And every day I would go there. One day I went, there was a policeman on a motorcycle on top. I'd go another day, there were kids playing football because you could throw the ball over the hill and not see where it's coming from, right? And so again, really thinking about these spatial dimensions of landscape and trying to bring them back to the public realm so that people actually think of them as architecture. And then with that, a practice will emerge. And so whether it's a fountain, that's as broad, 50 yards wide with figures that are scaled, I'm hoping people will see that they are scaled figures, right? And so there's an impulse towards that, or a tight grove of trees that people want to go in, or kids, kids basically tell you how to use space, if you plant trees close together, kids will go in. And so really kind of thinking about, how do we actually choreograph and think about space?
Could we actually have that last image again of the museum in Charleston? I think it's such a powerful aspect of your project and the building project, and also to think about how spaces like these and are so significant. You mentioned the horizon. And when you were talking earlier about the West Coast is about expansiveness, and the East Coast has a different sense of expansiveness, I think that the horizon that one would encounter here, first of all, I think from that vantage, you would see, for instance, Fort Sumter. You might see an outlying barrier island. And so it's not that you see the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's there. And so much of your work is about knowing, but also allowing for the serendipitous actions of individuals to occur. And I think that's something that actually is almost shared by architecture and landscape architecture, but in a way, landscape architecture has this other element, which is maybe that it's haptic and sensorial and temporal and spatial. It's this kind of amalgam of experience that, in the case of, or the example of the African American Museum, tells me something that even if you don't enter the museum, you have entered into a space that is for you as an individual, as a community, but it is also about you.
Yeah.
And that's where I start to really have to reflect on the ways in which architecture can be for people, and it can be reflective of an ethic that is acknowledging and recognizing how crucial it is to experience the past in this way. And to your point, memory as well. So there was and also I wanted to remark in the Q&A, you were talking about the palm grove, and Bridget Obakoya writes, "Palm trees remind me of the outstretched arms and hands of my ancestors." And that's such a beautiful kind of metaphor and idea to think about, that that grove, and maybe we could look at the previous image here, which has the palm grove.
I think it's the next image.
Is it the next one? Sorry.
At sunrise, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
there we are. Yes.
What's really wonderful about this project, being from the West Coast, this is the first time we ever planted palm trees in a design. But our landscapes on the West Coast have palm trees, but they always were pre-existing on the site. But this is the first time in which, I find it, this notion of upstretched arms, but, coming here and being able to plant palm trees was just a way. And we didn't want the palmettos, that normally grow. We wanted something that really had this power to it.
Absolutely.
And this is a wonderful thing of the sun rising in the morning.
Absolutely. So the last question that I will offer, unless there are others, is the following. How much of your practice, Walter, is research? And can you talk more about that? How do you begin a project? And what is the starting point to think about these complex connections that we have been talking about today?
That's a great question. And, before the pandemic and before Moreau and all of this stuff, our research was, it was in the office on the wall and everything. And now we have Moreau boards where there's all this stuff. And, we're going through this thing in my studio where I'm like, that's not research, right? It's not just pulling things. And, really to find, we're always searching for those kind of intangibles that you normally might not think about, right? Whether it's, a cultural history, an ecological history, something that is going to ground the work. Like we're working on a project here, just beginning one in San Francisco on a large office park. And instead of thinking about program and all that stuff, I started researching the geology of the area. And it turns out that this place has this incredible underfooting where all the other parts of the campus were always designed on this two-dimensional things where everything is shiny, right? And there's nothing that is grounding it. So our approach has just been working with geology and how do you use the ground to actually make something. And so the research gives us a point of view and a way to kind of stay the course without getting distracted, by all the bells and whistles of, contemporary design that you see in magazines and things like that. But, really find something real that you can always dig into. So that's how we really think of research.
I think that as an extension to Talia Morrison Allen asks, how do you walk the line between abstraction and more direct symbolism? And to what extent do you seek to make the ideas behind your designs clear versus wanting a visitor to come to their own conclusions? So in a way, I feel like research allows for a way of thinking through a project, but it never really stops, right? It's the design becomes the extension of the research. And to this point, I think they are mentioning the symbolism of the bodies.
Yeah. And I think that's a really big difference between, at least I think, between architecture and landscape, that, you can talk about a building in a very abstract way. It's still a building that has a door and windows, right? But landscapes, people want to know, well, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? And I think it's really hard, to, unless it's a piece of art, right? But to actually, I find that clients are always saying, well, what does that really mean? I'm like, it doesn't really mean anything, or I won't even say anything about it, right? It's just a paving pattern, right? So because I don't want everything to be pedagogical, right? That you come there, here's a sign that tells you. I want people to walk away from our spaces going, why, that was kind of weird, or feeling something and questioning it and not having a single answer, right? Or maybe having multiple sort of ideas about what something is. And I'm always taken by someone coming up to me and was like, I just visited this. Now I understand what you mean. I'm like, good, thank you. But again, I am not interested into a signature or making something always clear. To me, in spaces like this, you're going to return. And I want people, when they return, to possibly see something different.
Absolutely.
And to feel something different. And to think that the landscapes are going to evolve. That's the other piece, right? That landscapes evolve. Sometimes they evolve backwards. Sometimes, they disappear. Sometimes they, increase in scale. Sometimes they get things added to them. So they're in constant transformation to a certain degree.
I like to think of spaces in constant transformation. That's fantastic. And I was just imagining too that when you're talking about kind of openness as a public dialogue with the landscape, where we always forget about entropy, right? We always forget about that the image of a rendering or the image of a building will inevitably change, and so too the landscape. And
we have this discussion, in my studio a lot about, we started with the painting about this idea of the image, and it's so much part of a professional practice. You always are looking at a landscape. It's there, versus, I'm trying to bring us in, take one perspective, now give me 6 different views out of that drawing, because that's how we're actually going to experience. But we're always looking at these things from afar, right? Never here, and never sitting, never lying down, never. And those are ways, to me, in which painting and sketch, that allows you to kind of try to imagine just different ways of seeing things. And we get so used to that 2-dimensional and that frame. But landscape, that frame is constantly shifting. And that's a wonderful, I think, way of thinking about the work, where, at times things might line up and they might make sense, but other times things might seem that they're exploding and literally diverse.
Absolutely. We are a little bit past time, and Walter, you and I can always keep having conversations anytime, by the way. But I wanted to kind of conclude with just an observation that so much of what you are talking about is also telling us as citizens that we also are part of the landscapes in which we occupy, that we imagine, that we can build and design, and that with the work that you have done and are going to do, so much is wrapped up in how we want to slow down time, and how we want to slow down time in a way to see ourselves in new and unique ways. And so it's my great pleasure once again to always speak to you and to learn from you. and for sharing your time today with us before you get on a plane and cross an ocean. And so thank you very, very much, Walter.
So thank you, Sean, as usual, very welcoming to speak to you early in the morning. It actually feels like the middle of the day for me, but it's just really wonderful. And I like to just thank people who tuned in, and some of the questions I was just reading in the chat were just really wonderful. And I really just appreciate the thoughtfulness that everyone has sort of shared this morning.
Super. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thanks, Walter, again. Have a good day.